Hello and welcome to the impacts of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for your interest in foreign policy and your particular concern with this dramatic and historic situation. This video discusses the recent February 24th invasion of Ukraine by Putin's forces, which occurred from land, air, and sea. It is a strategic discussion on the impacts that the invasion will have on the world, particularly nation states in Europe and North America. I've tried to answer as many questions as I was asked on different platforms. If there's anything I've missed or if there's anything you'd like to know about, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to make additional videos. We first want to discuss why Putin invaded Ukraine. But before we do that, it's very important to acknowledge a few things, both historically and geographically about the region. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union and declared its independence in 1991 after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, at least at the time of this recording, and certainly at the time of the invasion, was not a member of the EU and not a member of NATO. Having discussed some of that very brief history, obviously, we just want to take a look at a map very quickly of the region and take a look at some of the strategic aspects of this region and why it might be important to the Russian Federation and the rest of the world. As you see on the right here, the Russian Federation is located along the borders of Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, and even Lithuania because of this little patch of Russian Federation land in the Baltic Sea. So all of these nations here actually have a land border with the Russian Federation. So obviously, when another nation state has land borders with you, it's very important to you strategically for economic, defense, social, cultural, all types of different reasons. As you see, Ukraine, a relatively large country, south of Belarus, west of the Russian Federation. And then Ukraine is surrounded by Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. And at the bottom here is Crimea, which was annexed by the Russian Federation in 2014, obviously very popular in the news. And then you'll see Turkey in the south of the Black Sea. The Black Sea, very strategically important to Russia and all these countries, both for, again, trade, economic reasons, defense reasons. And Bulgaria, also a nation that borders the Black Sea. Romania as well. So all these countries have very highly important strategic reasons to Russia, as discussed. And there are stated reasons, which is basically disinformation, that Putin puts out on reasons why he is claiming to be invading Ukraine. And his reasons basically are his gracious attempt to save the ethnic Russians and Russia from the what he calls drug addicted Nazis that are in control of Ukraine. He wants to remove the threat of NATO, obviously. Of course, Ukraine is not a NATO member, so that wasn't really an immediate threat, but he has made significant efforts within the basically the Russian propaganda bubble to make it seem as though Ukraine's joining of NATO is imminent, and it's existential threat to the Russian Federation. Now, having kind of gone over those stated reasons, the real reasons, and of course, this is just based on research and publicly made available analyses, but it's well known that the Russian Federation, Putin particularly, doesn't like the status quo. Another way we can say that is that he does not favor what is currently described as the rules-based international order. He thinks that the Russian Federation was treated unfairly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russia should be more central and integral to the rules-based international order. So he wants to disrupt that. Other reasons for invading another country, simply put, a land grab will allow you multiple different advantages if you can accomplish it. One, you have access to additional natural resources. You can use the additional land as a buffer zone. You can subjugate the leadership and the citizenry of those other nations or lands that you've invaded, and make them submit to your will, and basically expand your sphere of influence. So that's definitely something that we can conclude safely that the Russian Federation, and particularly Putin, is after. There is a lot of analysis on, and of course he said this, but there's a lot of opinion that Putin just wants to also secure his legacy as a great Russian leader. Historically, there are claims that Ukraine, or at least certain parts of Ukraine, should be a part of Russia. And he thinks that if he can make that happen, he would become more popular or re-legitimize himself as a strong Russian leader within the Russian Federation borders, and strengthen his position with the oligarchs. There's a lot of analysis on Putin, not necessarily concrete evidence or analyses, because certainly I don't have access to direct intelligence reports and first-person accounts of what Putin is like and what he's thinking. I'm not sure if anyone knows that except himself or someone extremely close to him, but there's always the question of whether Putin is a master strategist, and whether he's basically better and more equipped and always thinks ahead, certainly better than other world leaders. And he has this grand vision and everything is falling into pieces like a master chess player. It seems as though, and many analysts agree, that Putin is far from a master strategist. A lot of analysts believe that Putin has an end goal in mind. He will take a step towards that end goal, see what happens and what the consequences are of that particular step, and then decide what the next step will be. Nothing is necessarily written in a long strategic plan, and he's not moving the pieces better than everyone else in the world. It's important when considering what is on Putin's mind, that he has been in power for 22 years, autocratic ruler, a dictator. And typically history tells us that the longer a dictator stays in power, the more isolation they experience, because the longer you maintain your power, the less likely people are to disagree with you. So your mind begins to isolate, and everything you think is right, and it doesn't matter how outrageous you get or how irrational you get. So it's very possible that Putin at this point is 100% logical and totally with it, or he could have become completely irrational, especially experiencing even more isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there might be some paranoia. We don't know exactly, but it's very important to keep that in mind. Anytime we're asking what is Putin thinking, we have to keep in mind that maybe he is acting out of paranoia, or just pure isolation, and he's just started to begin to basically believe his own lies. And of course, Russian disinformation always plays into every decision that Putin makes. The Russian Federation, Russians have been master strategists when it comes to disinformation. They're very good at it. They tend to be able to double down on it, which makes the Russian propaganda bubble stronger. So outside of the bubble, a lot of these things don't make a lot of sense. But of course, inside the bubble, with the people that he needs to make these decisions and support him, they may just go with it. So Putin's pretext to war, pretty much nonsensical. And I'll make another video about the historic parallels of the Nazi invasions, the beginnings of their land grabs, and the parallels of Putin's land grab with Ukraine. But the pretext to war is basically nonsensical. Putin claims that Ukraine has been taken over by Nazis, and there are active genocides going on in Ukraine, and he needs to step in and basically save the people from experiencing that type of genocide. So right off the bat, Ukrainian leadership is not filled with Nazis. And if you've seen in my other posts, and this has been talked extensively, and it's very important to keep talking about this, the current president of Ukraine, who's still in Ukraine, is Jewish, and he has family that went through the Holocaust. So to call, it's pretty bold to call someone with that kind of background, with that kind of religious affiliations, a Nazi. It's pretty bold disinformation, and really only people in your sphere of influence and your propaganda bubble will basically believe that. But that's what disinformation is. And once one person shares that, and if they don't know any better, if they don't know Zelensky is Jewish, it becomes misinformation, and the pattern and the cycle just keeps on continuing. Putin also exaggerates the threat of NATO. There's actually, in the last 30 years, there's been a lot of discussion within NATO and other potential candidates to join NATO of why NATO even needs to exist anymore. NATO was originally a military pact made to deter the threat of the Soviet Union. So there were always discussions about why does NATO need to expand? Why does NATO even need to exist? Because there's no more Soviet Union. So in fact, by invading Ukraine, Putin may have actually proved that the NATO and the existence of NATO is still very much necessary. So NATO had not formally invited Ukraine to join. There are several steps that need to be taken, and they often take years to join NATO. So there was no imminent threat of Ukraine becoming a NATO member. There's also an exaggeration that's seen by Putin and his inner circle in the media that Ukraine's desire to become a nuclear power was also imminent, and some even made it seem like their nuclear ambitions were very close to becoming true. Of course, that is spun as a huge threat to the Russian Federation. Furthermore, just in a sense of a country like Ukraine, who has repeatedly expressed becoming closer with the European Union, becoming more of a democratic nation, if a large, closely knit nation such as Ukraine becomes more democratic, it is a threat to the oligarchs and Putin domestically because of the close ties between Ukraine and Russia. There'll be a lot of exchanges, a lot of family friends may see the benefits and the prosperity that Ukraine might actually enjoy if it becomes more of a democratic and more accepted by the West. And that may prove to be troublesome for Putin as a dictator in Russia, where people might actually, start to desire more and more integration with the West. What Putin, when he originally invaded Ukraine on the 24th, there's a lot of agreement in what he wanted to achieve and what he thought he could achieve. First, he wanted to secure the separatist regions once and for all, Donetsk and Luhansk to become basically parts of new Russia. There's very high likelihood that that will occur, and that is something that he will be able to secure. There's another possible analysis that what Putin is willing to accept and wants is basically a land bridge from Russia to Crimea. Currently, it's not connected by land. So by taking over this region in orange and at the bottom, if he captures this area, he'll be able to basically have a land bridge to Crimea. Obviously, he'll be able to control the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, where Mariupol is, in a much more strategically sound way, and basically have that as an advantage, and be able to call that a victory, especially domestically. He also very likely expected to be able to basically have a very quick invasion and reach Kyiv very quickly, be able to install a pro-Kremlin government, just like he has with countries like Belarus, and that would kind of be good enough for him. So, of course, we don't know what exactly Putin's goal was, how much, at minimum he'd be willing to accept. There are analyses that he could potentially want to just keep Ukraine very unstable. He could go in as so far as completely invade Ukraine, want to make it part of Russia. He could also advocate potentially for the breakup of it and have, again, there's this argument that, the Russians from Ukraine should just join Russia. The Romanians should just go back to Romania, and those parts be a part of, like, the Polish Ukrainians should just become part of Poland. So he may be pushing for that. We don't know until we see what he does. Certainly one of his goals, again, going back to not being in favor of the status quo and the current international order, he wants to destabilize Europe as that, the instability of in Europe can only benefit Putin, because it'll give him kind of more power to dictate what can happen, and his perceived threat of NATO will be more unstable, not as focused on deterring Russian actions. He also strategically likely wants to set an example or precedent that he can do this, particularly to countries like Finland, who are not NATO members, and that are under constant cyber threat and disinformation campaigns from Russia, that potentially Russia could, launch a land invasion into Finland or other countries that are not NATO members. And of course, again, strategically, he wanted to, and he's probably seen his answer. He wanted to test NATO's resolve. Will NATO come together? How extensively will NATO join together, and also join with Ukraine to deter the Russian and Putin's threat? What's actually happened is that the Ukrainian leadership has not fled, which is, shows a lot of character, obviously, but this is somewhat typical of what history tells us. The lands and the peoples who are being invaded are way more likely to stay and fight harder than those countries or those peoples that are trying to take their land. So the Ukrainian leadership has stayed. The Ukrainian military and all the volunteers are pouring into the country or staying. And we very likely may have a situation where a long insurgency will be established and continue to fight the Russian forces if they're successful in taking over the entire country. Of course, it seems like, especially at the time of this recording, that the advance into Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine were not as fast as Putin may have expected. And NATO's resolve may actually have surprised Putin. So NATO has united, especially internally. Historically, not many of the NATO members have met their commitments to have a certain percentage of their GDP spending on military. That seems to be changing very quickly. NATO members who had not sent any military hardware to active war zones, active conflict zones, have now begun to do that, and very quickly. Many of the countries that surround Ukraine have been accepting of refugees with open arms. So it seems as though at this point, both NATO has shown a commitment to Ukraine, and they have also united internally. At this point, Putin's options, as we discussed on what he wanted and what he expected, he may gain something tangible and then come to the negotiating table in good faith. So negotiation, the reason it's highlighted is because the next bullets are all conditions and tools that leadership typically uses in conflicts to better their negotiating position. So Putin's options at this point, and we somewhat have seen this because his progression of invasion is not as robust and is not as quick as he wanted. So he may actually begin more indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, civilian casualties and refugees. The more horrific these casualties are, and the more refugees it produces, will impact the hearts and minds of the West, NATO, EU, and North America, Japan, Canada, everybody. And I think he may be hoping that the more civilian casualties there are, the more likely that, of course, Ukraine and its allies will be coming to the negotiating table to make more concessions. There is also, and Putin may test this, there may be unintended and intended cross-border incursions with NATO members. For example, it will be very difficult at times to distinguish between Ukrainians going into, let's say, Poland or Romania to restock or to hide if there is an insurgency. So if Russian forces follow them into those lands, what will be the response of those NATO members? Will they invoke Article 5 and ask and consider that basically an invasion of, let's say, Poland or Romania, and actually ask the United States and the rest of NATO to launch a military operation against Russia because they've been invaded? So that makes the Western world a little bit nervous, and it's somewhat of a bargaining chip for Putin because he can test that. And we in the West want to avoid that. So we're more likely to want to come to the negotiating table and end that to prevent that. Of course, as we've already seen, the nuclear threat, the literal nuclear threat of the nuclear arsenal that Putin has at his disposal, he can, and then he already has, continue to make soft threats. For example, putting his forces on alert. And of course, he can continue to elevate the alerts to different levels. There could also be a hard nuclear threat. So he doesn't actually have to use his nuclear weapons, his tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He could begin testing of his nuclear weapons just to show that he has them and he's willing to test them. So even testing of a nuclear weapon is thought of as something that you should not do, is out of the ordinary within the current international order. So if he does that, it'll be again something to the minds of the populations and the citizens of Western countries that he's escalating, and we may basically go to our leadership that we've elected and say, look, these nuclear threats, soft or hard, are too much. You do need to go to the negotiating table. And then this has been publicized pretty well. Cyber attacks. He may increase cyber attacks on NATO members, EU members, and allies of EU or NATO. And, you know, the NATO members, especially countries like Latvia and for example, Romania, they are not they're not strangers to cyber attacks from NATO. They're not strangers from disinformation campaigns from the Russian Federation. So, and of course, neither are we, as they, interfered with our election pretty heavily. But the more cyber attacks we see, again, that might make us want to pursue or encourage our leaders to negotiate with Putin and end the conflict. And then, of course, overall, I think Putin's goal, and certainly as his option with all these things, is to try to demoralize American and EU citizens. There's always the talk of course, the cyber attack, being afraid of nuclear war, economic prices, the price of gas going up. He's hoping that'll demoralize and weaken our will to support Ukraine and continue to help them. And if we are demoralized, if we do give in to Putin's wishes, we're more likely to basically give up more of Ukraine. And lastly, what options does NATO have? NATO, the European Union, and our allies. Well, of course, the short-term deterrences with sanctions and, basically threatening Putin and telling him he shouldn't do this obviously did not work. I think many experts did not expect them to work, but they were a starting point to kind of make Putin the bad guy that was warned not to do this, so that further sanctions and harder isolation measures could be implemented if and when the actual invasion occurred. I think the big option for NATO is to degrade Putin's power long term. And it's very important. We don't often say this in public, but we can't do that too fast. If we all of a sudden, with a snap of a finger, 100% go from 0 to 100, Putin will be put in a position where he has nothing to lose. And that would become very dangerous, particularly considering that we don't know if he's acting rationally or not. So if all of a sudden everything at our disposal is imposed on the Russian Federation, and he feels like he's backed into a corner where he has nothing to lose, then he may actually escalate to levels where there's basically no return. So I believe the allies, NATO and the European Union, are doing a decent job of what they need to do to try to isolate the Russian Federation, Putin, and his oligarchs. So things like export controls with technology basically will hurt the Russian economy long term and slowly. Of course, we've already seen Russian banks and investment firms begin to limit the ability of foreign investors to take out their money. So they're already identifying this as a threat to their economy. Hard bank sanctions are very important. The SWIFT option, which needed to take place, of course, was not as much of a quote unquote nuclear option as it was originally stated in a lot of media outlets, because after the Crimea invasion, Russia actually began to kind of create their own SWIFT type system. Now, it doesn't necessarily, of course, their system doesn't work with, all of the European nations in North America and the rest of the world, but it does work with some of their close-knit allies and countries like Belarus, which, obviously fall very deeply within the sphere of Russian influence. So hard bank sanctions are important. obviously, regardless of SWIFT, Russian banks were still able to transfer money back and forth within other banks in other countries. Hard bank sanctions actually stop or significantly limit that. And then there's also going after Putin and his oligarchs' direct assets, restricting their travel, basically limiting and reducing their spheres of influence and power. When the oligarchs begin to see that they're losing money and power, this may actually force Putin's hand, because the oligarchs may no longer support him. And the big thing that may come out of that, it's unlikely, but it could, is that the oligarchs will actually either depose Putin or put so much pressure on him where he might actually have to resign, or stand at another election and not run again, basically. And of course, outside of the literal nuclear options, NATO also has some figurative nuclear options. The Ukrainians very much would like to have a NATO no-fly zone over Ukraine. This is a significant escalation if it were to occur, and may not. I think certainly Putin is not expecting that this would occur, because a no-fly zone implemented by NATO or any NATO member nation state will basically mean that our forces will be directly engaging Russian forces, which would be a significant escalation. And then, of course, speaking of escalation, there could be, not formally, but there could be a special circumstance where NATO member states take a vote and give some kind of special status to Ukraine and make them a temporary NATO member. And this would basically invoke Article 5, and then NATO would be in direct confrontation with the Russian forces. So these are some of the options. Of course, the situation continues to develop, but these are good strategic issues to keep in mind of why this is happening and what might happen in the future. Thank you for watching. There are more videos coming, particularly a special video on why Americans should care about Ukraine and how it is different from other conflicts and invasions that we've seen the last 10 years. So please subscribe to be notified of any upcoming videos. If you liked anything specifically covered, please don't hesitate to message me and let me know, and I will try my best to make a video discussing that.